Everyone in Coldwater laughed the day Faye Mercer paid $1,800 for the cursed house on Lowell Road. They were still laughing 3 weeks later. They stopped the morning she came up out of the cellar. But that morning was a long way off, and on the day she signed the papers, Faye stood alone in the county clerk's office while the woman behind the counter looked at her the way you'd look at someone who'd announced she was going to swim across the ocean. "You sure about this, hon?" the clerk asked, pen hovering. "That's the old Pell place? You do know about that house?" "I know it's the only one I can afford," Faye said, and signed her name. Faye Mercer was 63 years old, and a year and a half a widow. And until quite recently, she had been a registered nurse. 40 years on her feet on hospital floors. Nights, holidays, the long, quiet hours when families fall apart and someone has to stay calm. She had held the hands of the dying and caught newborns slick and squalling, and told more people than she could count the worst news of their lives in a voice that did not shake. She had been good at it. She had been, though she'd never have said so out loud, one of the best on that floor. The one the young nurses came to when they were scared, and the doctors trusted when the charts didn't add up. And then Jean got sick. Her husband had been a quiet, decent man, a high school shop teacher with sawdust in the creases of his hands, and the cancer took him in 14 months. Faye had nursed him herself, at home, at the end. And the bills had done what bills do to people who aren't rich. By the time it was over, she had buried her husband, used up her savings, and discovered that a lifetime of caring for other people leaves you, at 63, with a pension that doesn't cover much and a house she could no longer keep. So she sold the house she and Jean had loved, paid down what she could, and went looking for somewhere, anywhere, that a tired widow on a nurse's pension could afford to start over. That was how she found Coldwater, a small, fading town in the orchard country. Hills folding green and gray into the distance, the kind of place that had been somebody once and wasn't anymore. The great apple orchards that had built the town were long dead, the packing houses boarded, the young people gone. What was left was cheap. And the cheapest thing in the whole county, by a wide margin, was a 2-story farmhouse at the dead end of Lowell Road, listed at $1,800, sold as is. "That price is a misprint," the realtor told her on the phone, almost pleading. "I mean, it's not, but, ma'am, nobody's lived in that house since the 80s. It's the Pell house. There's a story. There's always a story," Faye said. The story, she learned soon enough, was this. 40 years ago, a family had lived in that house, a man and his wife and their 2 children. And over the course of one winter, the wife and both children had sickened and died, one after another, wasting away in their beds while the doctors stood around baffled. The husband had gone mad with it, people said, started raving, and after they were buried, he'd done something terrible down in the cellar. Nobody would ever say exactly what, only that it was the cellar, always the cellar. And then he was gone too. And ever since, the house had been cursed. Whoever bought it met with ruin, fires, bankruptcies. A man who'd tried to fix it up in the 90s had fallen sick within a year and never recovered. Folks said the ground itself was bad. Folks said the house took people. Folks crossed to the other side of Lowell Road rather than walk past its gate. Faye listened to all of it, standing in the overgrown yard on the day she came to see it, the wind moving through the dead grass, the house leaning gray and silent against a low gray sky. She did not believe in curses. 40 years of watching people die had taught her that death always has a cause. That the things people call fate or bad luck or God's will are very often just a cause that nobody bothered to find. It was the first lesson of her whole working life, and the truest. Something always did it. You just have to be willing to look. She looked at the cheap, sad, beautiful old house that nobody else in the world wanted. "I'll take it," she said, and the whole town of Coldwater laughed. The first thing Walt Kessler said to her when she came into his hardware store for a pry bar and a box of trash bags was, "You're the woman bought the Pell house." He was a big, stooped man in his 70s, with white stubble and pale, watchful eyes, and he said it not unkindly, but the way you'd note that someone had stepped onto thin ice. "I am," Faye said. "Faye Mercer." "Walt." He rang up her pry bar slowly. "You got someone helping you up there?" "Just me." He was quiet a moment. Then he said, in a lower voice, as though the cans of paint might overhear, "Do yourself a favor. Whatever you do up there, the floors, the roof, all of it, You stay out of that cellar. You hear me? Don't go down in that cellar." "Why not?" But he only shook his head and gave her change, and would not meet her eyes, and Faye walked out into the bright, cold afternoon, thinking that a town this small had nothing better to do than tend a ghost story for 40 years. The house, up close, was worse than the photographs and better than the legend. 4 decades of neglect had done their work. The porch sagged. The wallpaper hung in long, damp tongues. A generation of mice had lived and died in the walls. But the bones were honest, the way old farmhouses are honest. Square timbers and real plaster, built by people who meant it to last. Faye walked through the empty rooms in the failing light, and she did not feel evil there, the way the legend promised. She felt grief. The house had the heavy, held-breath stillness of a place where something terrible had happened, and no one had ever come to make it right. And in the front room, against one wall, there was a door. A plain door, painted shut, a skeleton key lock gone orange with rust. The cellar door. Faye stood in front of it in the dusk, and the cold seemed to gather around it, and she remembered Walt's pale eyes. "Don't go down in that cellar," and she found, to her mild irritation, that she did not want to open it. "Not tonight," she told herself, and turned away, and told herself it was because the light was going. She started on the kitchen instead, and it was there, the second day, scrubbing 4 decades of grime off the old enamel sink, that she met the neighbors. There was one other house within sight on that dead-end road, a small place behind a leaning fence, and from it that afternoon came a child. A small boy, maybe 6, thin as a reed, who came and stood at the broken gate and watched her work with enormous solemn eyes. After a while, a young woman came out after him, harried and tired in a way that aged her past her years, and called him back. "Cody, leave the lady be! He's no trouble," Faye called. "I'm Faye. Just moved in." The young woman's name was Lena Ross. She was the boy Cody's mother, raising him alone in the little house at the end of Lowell Road because it was, like Faye's, all she could afford. And as they stood and talked across the dead garden in the cold, Faye, who could no more turn off 40 years of nursing than she could turn off her own pulse, found herself watching the boy. He was too thin, too pale. There was a grayish cast to him, a tiredness no 6-year-old should carry, and when he scratched at his arm, she saw the skin there was rough and darkened in patches. Lena saw her looking. "He's just always been sickly," she said, defensive and exhausted at once. "Doctors can't find a thing wrong. They say he'll grow out of it. My mama used to say it's this side of town, bad luck side, the cursed side." She tried to laugh and didn't quite manage it. "Everybody out here on Lowell's got something. My mama had her troubles too, before she passed. You get used to it. You get used to it." Faye smiled and said something gentle, and Lena took her boy home. But Faye stood in the cold a long time after they'd gone, watching the light die over the dead orchards on the hill above the town, and somewhere far down in the back of her mind, in the place where 40 years of hard-won instinct lived, a very small bell had begun, faintly, to ring. It was nearly 3 weeks before Faye understood she was being poisoned. It came on so slowly, and she had so many ordinary reasons to feel poorly, that even she, even a nurse, nearly missed it. She was 63 and grieving and working herself to the bone in a cold house. So when the tiredness came, a bone-deep weariness that sleep didn't touch, she blamed the work. When her stomach turned and turned, she blamed the stress and the bad takeout from the gas station. When her hands and feet began to tingle, a faint pins and needles that came and went, she blamed the ladders and the cold. She was tired, and she was sad, and she was distractible in the way the recently bereaved are. So she did not, at first, do the thing she had taught 100 young nurses to do: step back and look at the whole patient. What made her finally look was her own hands. She was washing up at the kitchen sink one evening, the same sink she'd drunk from and cooked with and made her coffee from for 3 weeks, and the light caught her fingernails, and she stopped. There were lines on them, pale white bands running straight across each nail, one on every finger, neat and parallel, marching up from the cuticle. Faye stood very still. She knew those lines. She had seen them perhaps 3 times in 40 years. And every nurse who has seen them once never forgets them, because they are one of the few things in all of medicine that point, like an accusing finger, at a single answer. They had a name, Me's lines, and they meant heavy metal poisoning. They meant the body had been hit, weeks back, by a wave of something it was never meant to hold. Arsenic, thallium. Something in that family of quiet killers. She put down the dish towel. Her heart was going hard now, the slow, cold dread of a nurse who has just read the chart and seen where it ends. Tired, nauseated, tingling hands and feet. And now this. She laid the symptoms out in her mind the way she'd lay out a patient's chart, and they assembled themselves into a shape she did not want to see. And the shape had a name, and the name was not Curse. And then she thought of Cody, the thin gray boy with the roughened, darkening skin. The boy whose doctors couldn't find a thing. The boy whose family, and whose mother's family, had all had their troubles out here on the bad luck side of town. Everybody out here on Lowell's got something. She thought of the man in the 90s who'd tried to fix the house and sickened within a year. She thought of a whole family, 40 years ago, wasting away in their beds one after another over a single winter while the doctors stood around baffled. Wasting. Slow. The whole household, one after another. Doctors baffled. That is not what a curse looks like. That is what chronic poisoning looks like. That is exactly, precisely, textbook what it looks like. Faye Mercer stood in her cold kitchen with the white lines on her fingernails, and for the first time she was afraid of her own house, but not of any ghost. She was afraid of the most ordinary thing in the world. She was afraid of the water. Arsenic in water has no color. It has no smell. It has no taste. You cannot see it, cannot strain it out, cannot boil it away. A person can drink it every single day for years, and make their coffee with it, and bathe their children in it, and never know, because there is nothing to warn them. It is the perfect poison. It is, Faye thought, the perfect ghost. She did not drink another drop from that sink. She drove to the gas station and bought every jug of bottled water they had, and she sat up that whole night at her kitchen table, not drinking the coffee she was afraid to make, and she understood that the thing that had killed the Pell family 40 years ago had very likely been in this house the entire time, was in it still, and was, right now, at the end of Lowell Road, slowly killing a 6-year-old boy. And in the morning, she went to the one man in town who she was certain knew more than he'd said. Walt Kessler was alone in the hardware store, and when Faye walked in and said, without any preamble at all, "Walt, I need you to tell me what really happened to the Pell family," the big man went very still, and then he turned the sign on the door to closed. "I figured," he said, "you'd be the one to ask." Sooner or later, he lowered himself onto a stool behind the counter like a man twice his age. Most folks, they want the ghost story. The curse. Makes a good shiver. You. He looked at her, those pale eyes. "You came in here with the look my old man used to have when he was about to find something out he couldn't unfind." "What is it you already know?" "I know nobody got cursed," Faye said. "I know a whole family wasted away over one winter while the doctors couldn't explain it. And I know that's not a curse, that's a poison. And I think you've known it for 40 years. Walt was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice had gone rough. "Daniel Pell," he said, "was the best man I ever knew, and I helped this town destroy him, and I have had to live with that every day of my life since." He told her the whole of it. Then, the thing the town had spent 40 years burying under a ghost story. Daniel Pell had been a working man, orchard man, like everyone out here once was, with a wife named Carol and 2 little ones, Joey and Annie, and an older girl, Sarah, who was grown and married and gone by then. They'd had the place out on Lowell because it was cheap, the same reason everyone out there had it. And one winter the children took sick. Stomach troubles first, then weak, then weaker, losing weight, losing their hair, the little girl's hands and feet going strange and numb. Carol fell sick, nursing them. The doctor in town did what country doctors did in those days, which was guess, and his guesses were all wrong. And one by one, first little Annie, then Joey, then Carol, they died, that long, terrible winter, in that house, in their beds. And Daniel, Walt said. Daniel didn't go mad. That's the lie. Daniel got smart. He'd watched his whole family die of the same thing in the same house, and he was the only one who hadn't. And you know why he hadn't. Because the man drank. Beer, coffee at the diner, whiskey at night. Daniel Pell barely touched a glass of plain water from one year to the next, and it saved his life and damned near broke his mind because he figured it out. He figured out it was the water. He saved up and sent a sample off to some lab in the city, and it came back poison, arsenic, way over any safe amount. And Daniel Pell, half out of his head with grief, did the bravest thing I ever saw a man do. He came down off that hill and he started knocking on every door in this town, and he said, "It's the water. It's in the wells. My family's dead and your children are next. Somebody has to test the wells." And nobody listened, Faye said quietly. Worse than that, Walt's jaw worked. They listened. The wrong people listened. Because if the water on the west side of Coldwater was poison, then somebody put it there, and everybody in this town knew, without ever once saying it out loud, where it would have come from. Those wells sit downhill from the old thorn orchards, and the thorns sprayed those orchards for 50 years with the stuff they all sprayed back then, lead arsenate, by the ton, season after season, and that poison went into that hillside and it never left. It just sank, slow, down through the years into the water under the west side of town. Daniel Pell didn't just say the water was bad. He pointed straight uphill at the most powerful family in the county and said, "You did this to my children." Walt's hands were shaking now. Wallace Thorne owned the orchard, the bank, the newspaper, and 3 men on the county board. And he wasn't about to let some grieving orchard hand turn his family's name into the reason this whole town's water was poison, the lawsuits, the liability, the worthless land, the ruin of it. So he did what men like that do. He didn't argue with Daniel Pell. He erased him. Overnight, the story changed. Now Daniel was the crazy one. The grief had broken him. Poor soul. Then it got uglier. Folks started to whisper that maybe Daniel had done it himself, poisoned his own family. That maybe that's why he survived. And the house got a curse put on it. Real convenient, so nobody'd ever go poke around in it and ask questions. Walt looked at her, stricken. I was a deputy then, 24 years old. And when the sheriff sent me out to that house to tell Daniel Pell he wasn't welcome in town anymore, to run him off before he upset folks with his crazy talk, "God, forgive me, Faye," I went. I did it. I helped run the one honest man in this whole story out of his own town. He died a few years later, alone, 2 counties over, and everybody here called it a mercy. The store was very quiet. Where, Faye said, did he keep his proof? The lab results. The letters. A man like that, careful, smart, building a case, he'd have kept everything. He did. Walt's eyes came up slowly. He told me, that last day, raving, they'd have called it. He grabbed my arm and he said, "I put it all where they'll never look, deputy, where they're all too scared to go. It'll keep. Someday somebody'll have the spine to go down and find it." Walt swallowed. I never told a living soul. I think I didn't want it to be true. Faye felt the cold go all the way through her. "The cellar," she said. Walt nodded, just once, and Faye Mercer drove home and stood in the front room of her cursed house in the gray afternoon light and looked at the painted shut cellar door that she had been afraid of for 3 weeks, and she knew that everything, the whole 40-year lie, was waiting for her down there in the dark. She got the pry bar. The door came open with a shriek of old paint and older nails, and the cellar breathed up at her. Cold, mineral, damp, the breath of a place that had been sealed for 40 years. Faye stood at the top of the stairs with a work light in her hand, and the dark below swallowed its beam, and every superstition the town had ever poured into this place seemed to rise up out of that hole and stand against her. Something always did it, she told herself. You just have to be willing to look. She went down. The stairs were sound. The cellar was a low stone room, the foundation of the house, and at the far end of it she found the first thing, the well. An old hand-dug well, ringed in fieldstone, with a hand pump rising out of it and a pipe running up into the house. This was where the house drank from. This was the heart of it. She shone her light down into the black water far below and saw nothing. Of course she saw nothing, because there was never anything to see, and she thought of 40 years of people drinking from this exact stone throat and never knowing, and the horror of it settled on her like cold water itself. And then she found the boxes. They were stacked in the dry corner, 3 of them, cardboard gone soft with age, and someone had wrapped each one over and over in plastic sheeting, sealed with tape against the damp. They had been put down here on purpose, carefully, by a man preparing to lose everything and hoping. Faye knelt on the cold stone floor and opened the first one with hands that were not entirely steady. It was the Pells. The top of the box held the small, ordinary heartbreak of a family. A child's drawing of a house with 4 stick figures and a sun. A school photograph of a gap-toothed boy. A little girl's yellow hair ribbon, folded in a square of waxed paper as though it were precious, which it was. Faye had to stop for a moment, kneeling there in the dark, and press the back of her hand to her mouth. Annie, she thought. Joey. The names Walt had said. She understood, the first person in 40 years to be kind to these children, and they had been dead since before she'd ever heard their names. Beneath the keepsakes was the case. Daniel Pell had built it like a man building an ark. There were the medical records, his children's, his wife's, page after page of a country doctor's helpless notes, the weight dropping, the strength failing, the doctor reaching for one wrong answer after another. There was a thick clutch of handwritten pages in a hand that started steady and grew, over the months, more urgent. Daniel's own notebook, his observations, the dates of each new symptom, the dawning, terrible clarity of a man watching the pattern that no one would believe. And there, in an envelope he had marked in block capitals, was the lab report. It was dated the spring after they died. A laboratory in the city, the kind of place a desperate man might find in a phone book and spend his last dollar on. A sample of water from the well on Lowell Road. And a number, typed plain, beside the word arsenic. A number so far above the safe limit that Faye, who had spent 40 years reading numbers like this, let out a breath as though she'd been struck. Daniel Pell had been right. He had been right the whole time. He had figured it out alone, in his grief, with no training and no help. And he had been right, and they had called him mad, and run him out of his town, and let his house grow a curse over his proof like ivy over a grave. And there was one more thing in the box. A single sheet of paper, folded, the ink gone brown. A letter in that same hand, and across the front of it Daniel Pell had written, "To whoever is brave enough to come down here." Faye opened it, alone in the cellar, in the white circle of her work light. "If you are reading this," it said, "then you came down into the dark when everyone told you not to, and that means you are the kind of person I prayed would come. I could not save my Carol or my Joey or my Annie. By the time I understood, it was too late for them, and no one would listen to me in time to save anybody else. But the water is still poison, and it will still be poison long after I am gone and forgotten and called crazy. Somebody put it there, and that somebody let my children die rather than say so. I have left you everything I have. I am only one man, and they were the whole town. But maybe you are not alone the way I was alone. Maybe somebody will believe you. Test the water. For God's sake, before another child dies on this road, test the water." Daniel Pell. Faye Mercer knelt on the cold stone floor of the cursed house, holding a dead man's letter, and she thought of the gray, thin, dark-skinned boy at the broken gate. Cody. Right now. Today. And she understood that Daniel Pell's letter was not 40 years old at all. It had been written to her. She gathered the boxes into her arms, all 3 of them, the whole weight of it, and she carried Daniel Pell's children and Daniel Pell's proof up out of the cellar and into the light. And she did not go back down, afraid of it ever again. Faye did the thing the dead man had asked. The first thing, the only thing that mattered. She tested the water. Not one test. She was a nurse. She knew how a case is built. She knew that one result is a fluke and 10 results are a fact. She drove to the city, to a certified state laboratory, and she paid out of her own thin pocket. And then she came home and did the part that took courage. She went to Lena Ross's door, and to the 3 other still occupied houses on the west side of Coldwater, the poor side, the bad luck side, the cursed side, the side, she understood now, that sat downhill from the old thorn orchards, and she asked each family, gently, if she could take a jar of their water. "Why?" Lena asked, frightened, holding Cody against her hip. The boy looked up at Faye with his huge, tired eyes. Faye looked at the child, and she did not lie to her, because lying to frightened people was the one thing 40 years of nursing had taught her never to do. "Because I think your son isn't sickly, Lena," she said quietly. "I think he's being poisoned, and I think it's in the water, and I think it has been for a very long time. I'm going to find out for certain." but I need you to start him on bottled water today. Right now. Will you do that for me?" She watched the young mother's face go through fear and disbelief, and then, because some part of Lena had always known, had been told her whole life that this side of town just takes people, a kind of terrible recognition. "My mama," Lena whispered. "My mama died of a cancer at 50, and her sister." And her voice broke. "It's the water? It was the water the whole time?" "Bottled water," Faye said, steady as a hand on a wound. "Starting now. I've got you. Go." The results came back 2 weeks later, and they were worse than Daniel Pell's. Every well on the west side of Coldwater was over the limit, some of them many times over. Cody's house was the worst of all, and Faye, who knew how to read a poison the way other people read a clock, looked at those numbers and saw 40 years of bad luck rearrange itself, all at once, into a crime. The cancers, the miscarriages, the sickly children, the man in the 90s, the Pells. None of it had ever been a curse. All of it, every death, had come up out of the ground, out of the same hill, the hill with the dead orchards on it, the Thorn Hill. She could have stopped there. She was 63 and tired and alone, and she had already learned what the curse was, and the people who'd buried it were still powerful, and a wiser, smaller woman might have quietly moved away and let it lie. But Faye Mercer had spent her whole life refusing to let a thing lie when finding the cause might save somebody. It was the only religion she had, and there was a 6-year-old boy at the end of Lowell Road. So she did the thing Daniel Pell, alone in 1987, had never been able to do. She picked up the telephone, and she called for help, and she had help to call, because 40 years on a hospital floor does not leave you friendless. She called Gloria Aldridge, who had gone through nursing school with her a lifetime ago, and who now ran a public health program at the State Department of Health. She laid it all out, the symptoms, the pattern, the certified lab results, the 40-year history, the source uphill, in the calm, precise, unanswerable language of a professional who has built a case that cannot be waved away as the ravings of a broken man. There was a silence on the line when she finished. Then Gloria, who had also spent her life around suffering and did not shock easily, said softly, "Faye, do you understand what you found?" "Yes," said Faye. "I found out why the house is cursed. That whole side of that town is an environmental disaster site that somebody has been hiding for 40 years, Gloria said. "And honey, they are not going to thank you for finding it." They did not. The Thorns still owned Coldwater. Wallace was long dead, but his grandson, Preston Thorn, ran Thorn Realty out of a glass office on the square, sat on the county commission, and, Faye would learn, held a seat on the regional water board, the very body that was supposed to have caught all of this decades ago. Preston Thorn was a smooth, smiling man in good shoes, and when word reached him that the old widow in the cursed house was talking to the state about arsenic and orchards, he ran the exact same playbook his grandfather had run on Daniel Pell. First came the smile. Preston Thorn drove out to Lowell Road himself, all warmth and concern, and stood in her yard and told Faye how worried he was about her, all alone out here in this drafty old place at her age, in her grief. And then, wasn't it lucky, he happened to be in a position to help. Thorn Realty would buy the house from her. Today, $30,000, cash, for a place she'd paid $1,800 for. She could go anywhere, start fresh, put this sad chapter behind her. "It's not good for a woman your age," he said kindly, "to get worked up over old ghost stories." Faye looked at him for a long moment. 40 years ago, she said, your grandfather sent a deputy to run a man off this land for telling the truth. And now you've driven out here to do the same to me, only you've brought a checkbook instead of a badge. I'm not Daniel Pell, Mr. Thorn. I'm not poor, and I'm not alone, and I'm not afraid of you, because I'm 63 years old and I have already buried the only thing I was ever afraid of losing. You can keep your $30,000. I'm keeping the house, and I'm keeping the boxes that were in the cellar. She watched the kindness fall off his face like a mask off a hook, and underneath it was the same cold thing Daniel Pell must have seen 40 years before. And she understood, in that moment, that she had just made herself a powerful enemy, and that she did not care. The smile gone, the threats came, the way they had for Daniel. Quiet ones. Her property taxes got reassessed. A code enforcement man appeared and found a dozen violations. The word went around town, that crazy woman in the Pell house, stirring up trouble. You know how that house makes them. For a few weeks, it looked as though it might work all over again, as though Coldwater would close ranks around its ghost story the way it had before. Because a ghost story is so much more comfortable than the truth that your child's water is poison and your richest neighbor knew. But it was not 1987 anymore, and Faye Mercer was not one frightened man with a single lab report. She had certified results from a state laboratory. She had the names and the numbers of every poisoned well. She had Daniel Pell's entire 40-year-old case, vindicated now to the decimal point by modern science, the children's medical records, the original lab report, the letters the Thorns had ignored. She had Gloria and the weight of the state behind her. She had a living, breathing, sick little boy named Cody whose poisoning was happening right now, in the present tense, where no curse could be blamed and no grave could hide it. And she had Walt Kessler, who at 70-some years old finally found the thing he'd lost as a young deputy and stood up at the packed county meeting where Faye laid it all out and said in front of the whole town, in a shaking voice, "I was there. I helped run Daniel Pell off. He was right. He was right the whole time, and we killed him for it. And I have been ashamed for 40 years. This woman is telling you the truth." That was the night the laughing stopped. You could feel it go out of the room. The comfortable old story, the curse, the convenient shiver, and what came in to replace it was so much heavier. The understanding, settling over every parent and grandparent in that crowded room of what had really been killing their children all along, and who had let it. They turned, all of them, slowly, and they looked at Preston Thorne. And Preston Thorne, who had come to stand in the back in his good shoes, looked at a town that was not going to look away this time. And he understood that the ghost his family had built to hide their crime had finally, after 40 years, turned around to face them. It did not all come right in a day. These things never do. But it came. The state came. And then the federal people came. And they tested everything. And they confirmed all of it. The arsenic, the source, the long, slow path of poison down the hill from the old thorn orchards into the wells of the people too poor to live anywhere else. The west side of Coldwater was declared a contamination site. And the thing the Thorns had spent 2 generations and a whole ghost story to prevent came to pass anyway, only 40 years too late for the people it would have saved. The truth was written down, in official language, in a public record, where it could never again be called a curse or a madman's raving. Cody Ross got clean water that very first week, and bottled water for months after. And then, when the lines were finally run, city water, safe water, to the end of Lowell Road for the first time in the town's history. Faye watched the color come back into that little boy over a single spring, watched the gray go and the weight come on and the brightness return to his tired eyes, and there was no medicine she had given in 40 years of nursing that ever felt like that. The lines on her own fingernails grew slowly up and off the ends of her nails and were gone, and she took it as the house letting go of her at last. Preston Thorne did not go to prison. Men like Preston Thorne almost never do. But the lawsuits came from every family on that hillside and every family of the dead, and they took from him the only thing his family had ever truly cared about, which was the money and the name and the comfortable certainty of being untouchable in their own town. Thorne Realty closed its glass office on the square. The name came down off the bank. And in Coldwater, where the Thorns had been kings for 100 years, the name Thorne became, at last, the name of what had really cursed that house, and everyone knew it. And that was its own kind of justice, the kind that outlasts any sentence a court can give. But the thing Faye cared most about, in the end, was Daniel Pell. She found his daughter, Sarah Pell, the older girl who'd been grown and gone the winter her family died, 60-something now. 2 counties over, a quiet woman who had spent her entire adult life as the daughter of the man who, the story went, had poisoned his own children and cursed a house and died raving. She had carried that for 40 years. She had never come home. Faye drove out to see her, and she brought the boxes, the drawings, the school photograph, the little yellow ribbon, and the letter. And she sat in a stranger's kitchen and told an old woman the truth, that her father had not been mad and had not been a monster, that he had figured out alone what an entire town and a doctor and 40 years could not, that he had spent his last strength trying to save other people's children after he could not save his own, and that he had been right, that he was, in fact, the only hero the whole story had. He left it all in the cellar, Faye told her, where they were too afraid to look. He left it for whoever was brave enough to come down. He never stopped believing somebody would come. Sarah Pell held her little sister's yellow hair ribbon in 2 hands, and she wept the way people weep when they set down something they have carried so long they'd forgotten it had a weight, and she said, "All these years I thought I came from something terrible." And Faye said, "You came from the bravest man this town ever turned its back on, and now they're going to know it." They put up a small stone, the 2 of them, in the Coldwater cemetery, for Daniel and Carol and Joey and Annie Pell, together, with the truth on it at last. The whole town came. Many of them wept. Some of them were ashamed, and the shame was right, and Faye did not try to take it from them. As for Faye, she kept the house. She fixed it up, slow and steady, the way she did everything, the porch, the roof, the long-suffering plaster, and she painted it, and the people who passed on Lowell Road stopped crossing to the other side. She lived there. The widow who had been written off, downsized, used up, the old woman everyone laughed at, she had walked into a town's 40-year-old grave and turned on the light, and she had saved a child's life doing it, and she found, in that, a reason to get up in the morning that she had been afraid she'd buried with her husband. She was not done being useful after all. They had tried to retire her worth, and she had refused. And sometimes, in the evenings, she would open the cellar door, easily now, with no fear at all, and go down and stand a moment by the old stone well that no longer poisoned anyone. And she'd think about the man who had hidden the truth down there in the dark and trusted, against all the evidence of his cruel, ruined life, that someday somebody would have the courage to come and find it. He'd been right about that, too. People love a curse. It is so much easier than the truth. A curse asks nothing of us. A curse has no cause we have to find, no powerful person we have to confront, no comfortable story we have to give up. When children sicken and old folks die before their time and a whole side of town has bad luck, it is so much easier to whisper that the ground is haunted than to walk uphill and ask who poisoned the water, because the answer to that second question is almost always a person, and that person is almost always someone we are afraid of. But death always has a cause. The things we call fate, or bad luck, or a curse, are so often just a cause that no one was brave enough to go looking for. The truth doesn't disappear because we refuse to look at it. It only waits, in the dark, in the cellar, in the places everyone is too frightened to go, and it keeps right on doing its quiet harm, year after year, until one person finally picks up a light and goes down the stairs. And here is the other thing. The thing for everyone who has been made to feel they are finished, that their best years and their hard-won knowledge belong to the past, that the world is done needing them. A whole town looked at a tired old widow and saw someone to laugh at. They could not have been more wrong. 40 years of paying attention, of refusing easy answers, of the simple, stubborn faith that something always did it, and you just have to be willing to look. That was the one thing in all of Coldwater that could break a 40-year-old lie and save a living child. Your experience is not behind you. Your worth is not something the world gets to retire. So when they laugh at you, and they will, the way they laughed at Faye, the way they laughed at Daniel Pell before her, go down into the cellar anyway. Turn on the light. Look at the thing nobody wants to look at. That is how the laughing stops.